Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a new session of Chamber Talk. This is Sultan Khatoon from Abu Dhabi Chamber, and I'm glad to have you all on our 21st session of the program, where we host for the third time on Chamber Talk, Ziad Salloum from Salloum and Partners. Ziad will talk today about leading family businesses out of the pandemic and how to never let a crisis go to waste. History and human nature proved that what's probably good about tough and challenging times, such as the one that we're living in right now, is that most of the times we adapt and we adjust and get out stronger. We get out with new and fresh ideas for improvement. And most importantly, we get out with a good memory of lessons learned and best practices for dealing out with similar challenges in the future that we usually as well transfer to our children and grandchildren through what we call history. So history is one of the main common factors among all family businesses. Actually, it's history and legacy what best defines existing well-known family businesses. And probably what first comes to mind when trying to interlink between both is the normal transfer of all different types of wealth and capital throughout generations from ancestors. And as we mentioned in one of prior sessions of Chamber Talk with EY on family businesses, titled Protecting the Business by Protecting the Family, when we refer to wealth, we don't really mean only the financial wealth or capital, but we refer to all 6 dimensions of wealth that is represented by virtual capital, financial capital, human, family, structure, and social capital, which are all interconnected. If you're interested in knowing more about detailed aspects of each of these dimensions, I would highly recommend you to visit our YouTube channel and refer to the 12th session of the program. It could be an opportunity as well to navigate through the different interesting topics that we covered to date on the program, as it is all recorded and available on the YouTube channel. As mentioned earlier, and in many occasions, family businesses have been and will always remain the backbone of our economy. They generate more than 80% of the region's GDP and employ around 70% of the workforce in the GCC. So family businesses had their share of the hit from the pandemic. And probably for them, the hit took different shapes and forms. As on top of the economic and operational impacts that the pandemic had on different types of businesses, for family enterprises, it also resulted in mixed impacts on family relations, which have brought to light the need for more and better communication among all family members. Bottom line, I would say, regardless of the damages resulted by the immediate direct or implied impacts of the pandemic, we are certain that family businesses will find a way through as they did before, and they will thrive. And Ziad is with us today to discuss this point in specific. A brief intro about Ziad for the third time. Ziad is a second-generation family business member and a partner at Salloum and Partners, a boutique law firm which was founded 4 decades ago in 1980 by his father, Mr. Samir Salloum. As mentioned over the prior sessions, the firm, Mr. Samir and Ziad, all received various awards for their achievements and in recognition for their services. The most recent one for Ziad was in 2018, if I'm not wrong. Probably, I don't know if Ziad received something right after, but as to my knowledge, the last known one was 2018, when he was named the leading employment law attorney of the year by Acquisition International. Without any further delay, I will pass it to Ziad to kick off the presentation. But as usual, before that, I would like to remind you that you can access this presentation as well, this session in parallel in Arabic via the link that the team will share in the chat box. And that we'll have the last 15 minutes of the session for Q&A. So please share whatever questions you have via the Q&A box, and me and Ziad will try to go through those during the last 15 minutes of the session. Ziad, it's all yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sultan, for the introduction, and hello, everybody. I think you have my profile up there. Sultan's introduction is largely as kafa wafa, as we would say. Very kind of him. We're, like Sultan mentioned, we've been around for, well, this year, 40 years. No chance to obviously host a party because of everything that's happening. So we'll have to delay that for a while. So we're a family business ourselves, and that makes us acutely aware of the unique dynamics of family businesses here in the region. And so our work in assisting family businesses in managing the succession or transition from one generation to the next has been facilitated by the fact that my father is able to speak to and understand the position of the principals, while I can speak to the concerns of the next generation, even if I'm no longer as young as I once was, so to speak. So with that, so everything I'm going to give you today is not so much looking at things from a legal perspective, which is unusual since I'm a lawyer, but I'm going to be looking at it more from a general either business or holistic sense, and we will use, or I'll touch on very briefly probably, some of the tools that are at the disposal of family businesses to tackle some of the issues or some of the problems as they go on, or the strategies that they wish to employ. Some of these tools may be of a legal nature. Others can be, well, there's the various other tools that are at the disposal of family businesses in general and businesses in particular. So with that said, we can kick it off. So that's us, yeah, okay. So here, like I said, there's going to be quite a bit to cover, so I'm going to try and be brief. Unfortunately, that means that it comes at the expense of a little bit of detail, but hopefully we will still be able to touch on some of those things. And if there's anything obviously that's of interest to you, then during the Q&A we can maybe dive a bit more deeply in them. So I guess at this point in time, it's there's no need to go over the specifics of what the pandemic is and the impact it's had. Most of you already have seen everything that's happened in the region over the period. But businesses now, well, we're hearing anything and everything from, well, hey, 2020 is a complete write-off to, everything else. And some of the data that's coming up at the moment, so there's a Harvard Business Review survey that I've mentioned here, but there are others like Tharawat Magazine. They've surveyed also about 200 family businesses. And they found that a significant majority were impacted in some form. So they found that about 5% of their responses found family businesses were in danger of failing. 44% had suffered significantly. About 40% had been affected in a minor way. 4% only were not affected, and the rest are in the positive impact type category, either a little bit or a bit more. But typically, what seems to be clear from much of the literature at the moment is that most family owners, they've been quick to rise to the challenge that the pandemic has faced on them. And some owners have even opted to get much more closely involved in the business if they had been a bit more pushed back previously. So it's a lot of them obviously have found this as a time that tests both family relationships, the values of the business, their relationship with stakeholders. And so it's extremely important for owners to make sure as they go through this that their governance systems are working well, that their executive management team, whether they are professionals or external non-family members or family members, that those relationships are working as intended, and that they're involving the next generation in a meaningful way, so that one, they can learn from this experience, and because this is like one of the most challenging times ever, even if families have experienced many crises before this one is very different in nature. And so the ability to bring in the next generation to help bounce ideas off is obviously something that a family business can cherish. So the first bit is, why are we talking about family businesses in general? Why isn't this a discussion about what can businesses in general do? Well, the core is because family businesses are different. They have very specific, very unique strengths that are, more or less we can generalize across family businesses, and they also, as a result, face very unique challenges. So these can be used to inform either their short-term plans or their longer-term plans as they go down. So that they have, and you'll find as we go down this list of these advantages or the disadvantages, you'll find that effectively they're mirror images. The same thing can be an advantage in one sense, if it's, if it's leveraged, but at the same time, it can be a source of, let's say, a significant disruption. So, for example, if the family is extremely cohesive and they're working very well and they've got very good communication and they're able to operate together well, then that's an extraordinary advantage that you'll find no other business can basically compare to a well-functioning, well-oiled family business where the family is functioning well and working and aligned with the family council, if you have one, with the management team, the board members, the management team, and the stakeholders involved, like the employees, if you have family members who are employees and so on. If the relationship is dysfunctional between these various components, it can be a recipe for disaster. So, like, as you go down the list, I mean, you have, in terms of, for example, the fact that this is probably not the very first crisis that a family business has gone through. At the very least, they've gone through the 2008, 2015 crises, for instance. And as a result, they may have become a bit more risk averse, which means they may have saved up quite a bit of money on the side for a rainy day, which this might be considered to be, depending on the nature of the thing. So an advantage that also that family businesses have is that they tend to be very much more focused on the stakeholders, on their employees, on their suppliers, on their relationships. Reputation is extremely important for families that are in business, much more so than, let's say, a typical, joint stock company or whatnot that's only focused on maximization of shareholder value, setting aside everything else. So the culture and the values of a family, those are powerful tools that can be used by the family to engage with their customers, with their suppliers, with their employees, with the community at large. And they tend to obviously, and one of the biggest things that sets family businesses apart is their resilience. So what about the challenges? Well, typically, obviously, family businesses tend to be risk averse, particularly in this region where you tend to see people, family businesses traditionally being focused more on bricks and mortar type businesses, so retail and that sort of thing. And those are some of the sectors that have been the most severely impacted by the pandemic and the precautionary measures put into place also to kind of curb it. The fact that also a lot of family businesses, I mean, about 70%, I think, give or take, in the region, are likely to have a transition event within the next 5 to 10 years. So many are in a phase where they're working on or preparing or planning that succession, the transition and the government and building the governance structures around it. So bringing a crisis in the middle of that can make life a bit more difficult for family businesses. And then family businesses, as a result, are having to make trade-offs between objectives that previously would have been probably unimaginable. All of this while you're dealing with the complex dynamics of a family and all the rest of it. So you've got the stress, the anxiety, sometimes the fear that comes out in a crisis, and that can amplify these already challenging dynamics, and that can paralyze decision making. It can cause conflict to spiral out of control. It can be quite disastrous. Now, thankfully, so far, it doesn't look like the data has a relatively small amount have experienced a rise in conflict. I mean, according to the Harvard Business Review, their study is about 30%, though. That's quite significant, but it's not as bad as one could have imagined. So on the flip side, you've also got about 25%, about a quarter of family businesses that have actually managed to band together and experience a really positive impact as a result of all this, where family members can either put aside their differences and take actions that allow the business to survive and even set the stage for it to thrive again once you're out on the other side of all this. So one concern I've heard voiced from some families in business here is that sometimes the older generation, the older generations, the older principals that are, for whom this is, you know, they might not be that open to change. And some of them are, I think time is helping in that sense. But some of the older principals I've heard mention that, look, we just give it a bit of time and things are going to go back to normal after a while. Yeah, but we don't. The point is, you don't know how long it's going to take. None of us do. It could take a year or two until we find a vaccine or there are proper treatments that work, and until the vaccine kind of integrates into every aspect of society, and then we start to see a rebound from an economic perspective, whether locally or regionally or even worldwide. We've got to plan for the worst case scenario as well, which means we even if we're hoping that things are going to go back to normal right after, we still need to plan today for things that are going to, in case things don't go quite that way. So moving on. So ultimately, the impact of the pandemic on family businesses is really going to depend on the decisions that families take at this point in time, or decisions that they choose not to take at this moment. And the trade-offs that family businesses might find that they have to make in response to all this. So with all this doom and gloom, is this really like the end of the world as we know it? You have sweeping alarmist statements that are very common now, especially these days in the news and various articles and whatnot. It's the end of the retail world. Everything's moved online, that sort of thing, all of this stuff. But on the flip side, like we mentioned, some people are just thinking, okay, look, things are going to go back to normal, and you just wait it out. And as long as you can wait it out as much as you can, you will be fine eventually. But ultimately, in the meantime, regardless whether it's your views are one way or the other, what are you going to do in this intervening moment while you find a solution to kind of either replace the failing, let's say the businesses that you think where the trends are going downwards, or otherwise to just keep things the status quo as much as possible today until things go back to normal down the line? Are you going to cut employees, remove employees, or reduce their wages, their benefits? Are you going to affect your relationships with customers by reducing their credit lines, for example? Or are you going to cut certain types of services or product lines? What about your relationship with suppliers? I mean, you can't please everybody. At some point, you may have to make some adjustments in one side that may affect others. There will, at some point, be a trade-off if you pursue in this way. So you could delay planned investments, the new fancy, machinery for the new plant, or a new office, expanding your office space, whatever it is, the investment plans or the development plans that you might have, those might face the chopping block, or at least be, you press the pause button. The same with owners. I mean, what if you decide you want to maintain everything else, or you want to make some cuts here and there, but then ultimately you end up reducing the dividends that are going to be distributed to some family members or to the family in general? Is this something that is going to backfire, or that you're going to get significant pushback from the owner, from the rest of the owning family? Those are some of the trade-offs that businesses are going to have to look at or consider. So in that sense, so what's the recipe for survival here? What do you succeed? How do we succeed? So here, I'm going to give you a small anecdote that might kind of help illustrate what I mean. And I'm asking you here to consider the megalodon. I don't know if any of you have heard of the megalodon, other than the crazy Hollywood movies that may have come out in recent time. But effectively, the megalodon was the largest shark that ever lived. It grew to about 30 meters in length. Its teeth, like the one that's in the image here, it's one of the ones I own, it could reach over 16 centimeters in length. Mouth open, it was so big that a 2-meter tall person could walk through it without having to bend his head. It basically ruled the seas from about 25 million years ago to 2.5 million years ago, give or take. So the reason I'm asking you to consider this extinct animal is to consider why it went extinct. And effectively, from what we've understood, is that there were external pressures on it. So there was a changing climate, cooling waters and that sort of thing, which changed currents and all that. Eventually, what that impacted in a relatively short period of time, the species that it was preying on, those species got smaller. And the megs, let's say, they started competing for the same smaller prey with their much smaller, more agile cousins and other predators besides. So between carnivorous whales and the ancestors to the great white today, so the smaller cousins of the megalodon, eventually the megs couldn't keep up. It's not obviously not the only factor to their demise, but it was certainly a significant one. So ultimately, it doesn't matter how big you are, how strong you are, how tough you are, how mean you are, how established you are. Ultimately, what matters is going to be how fast you can adapt to a change in your circumstances, especially the ones that come and hit you this way that you have no control over. That adaptability is what's going to is what's going to determine who survives and who succeeds going down the line. And in general, regardless of whether this crisis is there. Because I don't think that any multi-generational family business has continued working in the same line of business, or very few of them at least, in the same line of business since inception. At some point in time, they will have needed to move to a different line of business. So adaptability is ingrained within family businesses in general as a concept. And so this is if there's one idea that I would hope that you take away from this, it is we need to find a way to adapt, all of us, to a new normal, or to circumstances that are wonky, for lack of a better word. So what can businesses do? Well, a lot of family businesses, they've been reporting they've been reporting that they've been using quite a broad range of tools to mitigate the impact of the crisis, and particularly to manage cash. So things like they've delayed CapEx about 61%, as far as I understand from some of the surveys. They've reduced employee costs by either cutting salaries or furloughing, letting go of staff. And about a third have reduced dividends for the family, and about just under a third, actually, it seems, have been trying to shore up their balance sheets through additional borrowing. So, setting aside these things here, the traditional toolkit that a family business can use, perhaps what we need to look at is, if we want to become adaptable, what we need to be able to do is learn to take and make big decisions relatively quickly. What differentiates companies like Amazon and Tesla and Google from other companies is that they take informed decisions extremely quickly, and they implement them extremely quickly. And then they will, if they find that a decision that they've taken doesn't function well, isn't consistent, or isn't going to lead to the desired result, they'll drop it in a flash and move on to something completely different. And that ability to just kind of drop something and start over is what makes them, is one of the drivers that makes them succeed the way they have. And maybe we can take a page out of that book. And in that sense, what they look at, what they've developed in some parts of the US is this culture of intelligent failure. They want people to fail fast, fail with the minimal expense possible, and then redesign and redevelop. I met somebody once from who used to work with Microsoft. He's an ex-executive from Microsoft. He ran a team that effectively just kept failing. Microsoft didn't just keep him on, well, they threw more money at him. Something like 10 years. Over 10 years, he lost over $1 billion. But then, one small breakthrough in the research he was doing made them recouped over $14 billion from this one small breakthrough. So if he was, in our culture here in the Middle East, if somebody just keeps failing for 10 years, you're going to throw him outside. You're going to say, thank you, bye-bye, that doesn't work. It's not part of our culture. We tend to see failure as something to be avoided at all costs. But intelligent failure, where you test something out and you learn from it, and then you move on to something else, and that doesn't cost you a significant sum, but you're able to kind of just say, okay, yeah, let's try this. If it works, quick wins, we do this, great. If it's starting to lead something somewhere, we proceed. That maybe family businesses in the region can become a driver of a cultural shift on this sort of thing. So that way we would effectively be rewarding effort and not just the results. And in a similar way, you know, we tend to, you know, especially in family businesses, you know, consistency is key. We'd like to think we work that way, but perhaps it's okay for us to change our mind. And that doesn't necessarily make you inconsistent if the circumstances warrant. As a very public example, for instance, you know, in the first quarter earnings call for Tesla, they were asked a question as to whether or not they were going to be making another capital raise. And Tesla's response was, we have no plans for another capital raise. But just a few weeks later, the stock shot up from, I think it was around 300 to over 700. And they used that opportunity, that small change in circumstances, to raise another $2 billion for really cheap without diluting shareholders significantly. So that's that ability to just kind of shift around and try something again different is something that we can maybe learn from. So here that brings me to the central point, or the central theme of this presentation, is seeing the crisis here as an opportunity. And I don't mean it here as an opportunity to find a new business model, or as a business opportunity to kind of make more money. What I mean is an opportunity to do things that are, you know, that reinvigorate and reinvigorate the business, that can allow you to do things within the business that you've been wanting to do for ages. Take us, for instance, in our firm, because we are, you know, we tend to be much more involved with our stakeholders, including our employees. You know, it's not so easy to take some sweeping decisions. But when the pandemic hit, within 2 weeks, we were able to move everybody online. Something that people have been resistant because they like this face-to-face thing. So we moved everybody online. We got them onto Microsoft Teams. We implemented our new practice management system. Everything was, they just take their laptop and they can work anywhere around the world pretty much. And that is something many of them were resistant to do. We managed to do that in 2 weeks. And we got them engaged and involved in wanting to do this. It was an opportunity to do stuff that we've been dying to do for ages, but that either we didn't have the ability or the time, or basically the patience to kind of navigate, you know, the relationships with the stakeholders to get it done. Now you maybe have the opportunity to get it done and get it done fast. And these are changes that are not just in response to the immediate crisis, but these can position the business for the future as well. And it's an opportunity to re-examine your governance systems and your structures. Do you have the involvement of the family, the owners, the board, the management? Is there a gap somewhere? How can you plug that gap? Do you have a clear outline as to who's able to take decisions, how these are made? What are the limits on authority? Do you need to make changes to the statutory documents to allow those that need to take decisions now to do those? How are you going to make these important decisions? Do you have to basically see, is it time to speed up the handover to the next generation? We've seen that happen a few times. But we've also seen on the flip side, some principles that had taken a step back and that suddenly jump back in because, hey, now it's time to retake control. There's no right or wrong answer. Each answer is going to depend on the family in question and on the business that they're running. But at least those questions, it's an opportunity to relook at these things. So effectively, change really is inevitable. It's essentially the only constant that we have in life. But crises tend to accelerate or force change upon us. What we can do is we can use the crisis as an opportunity to bring about conscious, informed change, not, you know, go with the flow and then what we're forced to do by circumstance we end up doing, rather than bringing the change about ourselves. That's kind of at the core of all this. And a central one as well is, and in terms of opportunity, is the opportunity to revisit your business lines and your operating models. What are you going to be able to focus on? See what can you are there opportunities there? What is your competition doing or not doing? If you're able to act fast and capitalize on something, you can achieve significant leverage before a competitor is able to mobilize, because they maybe tend to be slower. Because of an advantage of a family business is you can take decisions relatively quickly and implement them quite quickly. And a crisis can be an opportunity to hunt for bargains. I think something like 15% of family businesses that were surveyed by Tharawat were planning to make acquisitions during this time. And that includes businesses that were negatively affected by the crisis. You have owners now obviously clearly recognizing that ultimately, there are a number of companies that are going to be that are going to be coming out of the crisis on top, even if today they're not quite in the shape that they would like. So there are two pieces that I'm going to look at in a bit more depth, two aspects. So the first is the innovation or pivoting, basically, implementing change via a pivot, and the other is going to be looking at governance systems and structures, and particularly with a focus on succession and transition. So for the first one is, well, what's a pivot? Well, effectively, it's at its most basic form, it's essentially just a shift to a new strategy. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to change everything your business is doing, but it can be a tiny response to a specific discrete need, and we'll explain a bit more down the line. So a couple of examples of pivots are up there on the screen, so I won't repeat them. But essentially, when you do choose or select a pivot, make sure you just choose one that has room for growth. The last thing you want is to invest time and effort and money into a pivot and then find there's little to no runway or no room for improvement down the line. So in terms of how do you find pivots, basically? You could look at them by tackling or answering questions that look at your value proposition, your value network, and your target clients. Right. So it could be, for instance, a new service. You move from, say, like one company locally in the region that moved from providing domestic cleaning services, which are not very much in demand these days, clearly, to sanitation services, which are very much in demand. So they remobilized their existing employees and providing something related but somewhat different. So that's a definition, an example of a pivot. Another example is, let's say, is LVMH. They repurposed their perfume manufacturing operations to make hand sanitizer. So you're leveraging your existing assets and processes and employees to just make something different, a different item. So by looking at your value proposition, what does your customer base need today? Are they looking for food, health, education, etc.? And then how can you repurpose the assets that you've got to create this new value? Whether you're targeting the same customer or a different one, it doesn't, that one is not that, that's fine as well. In terms of your value network, can you deliver things differently? Can you get paid online instead of getting paid via card, machine, or in person? Those are all forms of pivot. So some of them are fairly straightforward, right? Many companies, you'd think, hey, it's the simplest thing in the world to just move to an online payment system. There is a company, a client of ours that implemented it within a week from when the pandemic hit. And, their closest competitor, I think maybe, as far as I understand, their biggest competitor, maybe just a couple of weeks ago, started implementing that, if any, if at all. So if you get in first, you can capitalize this. And that is something you can add value to your customer based on this. Your customer doesn't have to come to you. You can pay from anywhere. It's fantastic. Who doesn't want that? And then obviously there's your target client. It's not just about finding a new customer or that sort of thing, but also, can you build social capital with your customers? For example, some companies have moved online and have leveraged social media to engage directly with their clients, with their customer base, which is not something they used to do previously or that they needed to do. They felt they needed to do before these times. So they're not actually selling them something. They're basically just trying to engage with them. And that's building that capital, that connection between the customer and themselves. Another one is, another example, which is often quoted, if you like, is between two supermarkets in a, I forget which city now, that had been hit by a natural disaster. One of them hiked the prices of water and the other didn't. So after the crisis ended, obviously, the company that didn't hike the price of water had built up quite a lot of social capital with its customers, and those customers found in the same rewarded the loyalty that the company had given the customers during the difficult time. So there are many different ways to build social capital that don't necessarily involve, changing the way you work. But where you can find a pivot that where the customer can find a benefit and you can find a benefit as well. And in doing this, you don't have to scrap all the work that you've already done, because you don't need or require a radical change, of course, at least not in every single case. You need to identify what you can salvage, what you can keep, what you can reuse. And once you've settled on a new direction, you should be able to use those resources towards this new goal. And similarly, in determining which pivot you want to go to, you should be obviously listening to your customers. If the feedback you receive from customers is great, is good, then you're going down the right path. I'll give you a couple of quick mini case studies that can maybe help illustrate some of these points. So these are examples of clients of ours so the ones that are clients of ours and where the information is not public, I can't disclose who they are. There's one example where I will actually disclose who it is, but because it's something that everybody virtually knows, and I'm sure some of you already you'll understand in a minute. So basically, we have one service business that essentially realized that people obviously were not going to be spending except on the things that are necessary. But this was a service business that was selling packages. So let's say you have to use up your package over a period of time in multiple chunks or whatever it is. So they found that, they kept their employees engaged and they kept the clients happy by providing the balances of packages, by calling up people and telling them, well, hey, you've still got X whatever chunks of your package that you've not used up. Do you want to use them up now? Clients were happy. They were getting, they got engagement from the client, and our client was engaging with their employees who weren't sitting there twiddling their thumbs because there's no new business. In the same way, they implemented an online e-payment system, and they were able to sell products or packages for the future period, after post-pandemic, but today. So they got cash in from now. So that helped offset some of the impact to their business, and they obviously incentivize their staff on this basis. Similarly, we've got a medical service business that was able to kind of jump on the Zoom type call thing with their patients, and some of their patients are in Al Ain and in other places that have to drive long distances to get to them. So they were now able to monetize this, have Zoom sessions with their patients. Obviously, the one big thing that they couldn't do, remotely are the prescriptions. But in their business model, that specific model where they follow patients over a period of time, that made the client happy and the center in question happy. The third small example I'll give you is Carrefour. Well, as many of you probably already know, the UAE market's typically been quite slow to jump on this online sales bandwagon. There's been obviously an upward trend towards that, and as a result, the malls have been starting to have more F&B and other service outlets to attract footfall. But the adoption speed, I think the adoption speed of online sales changed significantly with the pandemic. And a key indicator or a key example of this was Carrefour. They had an online platform prior to this, but it was somewhat basic. But they reinvented themselves, and the speed with which they did this is remarkable. And since then, they've been making one improvement after another. And some of the bigger competitors that I won't name at this point were very slow to jump onto this. Their platforms remained as basic as they were before, very little improvement. So it was instantly around me, you could hear that people were changing and moving on to this. And they were speaking about the improvements that were made by Carrefour. That's already an extremely fantastic ability to leverage the changes they're making to add value to for their clients. So one of them, for example, is one I mentioned to Sultan in a recent call, was this ability to just kind of open their app, scan the barcode on a product that you previously purchased from Carrefour, and it'll directly allow you to select that specific product instead of you having to go search for it. You know, at the time when nobody else was doing stuff like this in the region, it's extremely remarkable. That's an excellent example of a strong pivot. Moving on to our governance structures and the systems. So the governance structures that are in place for a family business, they have to meet the needs of this family, obviously. So you need to, like we explained before, you need to look at, are you getting enough support, especially the management team? Are they getting enough support from everybody? Do you need to revisit any of the policies? And how often are key people communicating? How are they doing that? Especially since today, you know, you can't do the face-to-face stuff that most people are used to, especially family businesses where you sit in the majlis and discuss. It's difficult to do this in this climate. So what are you going to do? So some families have had their board members, the family business board members, put together a crisis committee to help navigate the crisis decision making. In others, especially where the founders have stepped in and back into executive roles, or the older generation stepped into executive roles, this has sometimes led to strained relationships with management. And even with other stakeholders, like with employees and others, where especially if the communication about the change hasn't been managed well. Imagine one day, the principal walks in and suddenly he's giving orders, and the employees are sitting there. Well, you've not been here yes, you have an office, but you've not used it for ages. I mean, and he's giving conflicting instructions to what the rest of the management team had been giving just up until that point. So these. Having clear alignment across the board, across the owner group, across with the management team, the board, it's essential. If you don't have these in place, you can see we can see tensions building and conflict occurring. So there are other things that you could use as well. You could jump onto this as an opportunity to maybe it's a good time to kind of restructure the way the business is put together. Convert, either split apart different chunks or different parts of the business into independent legal entities, and then take advantage of the fact that there are lower transaction fees or registration fees now because of the pandemic. Maybe the family has significant real estate holdings, and they can leverage also the fact that there are reduced transaction fees to let's say, shift their holdings under a foundation or some other an independent legal entity, or pool assets together, whatever it is that the family business wishes to do, or the family as a whole wishes to do. But on the flip side, you need to see is whether in the middle of a crisis, this type of activity, is it going to be a distraction for the management team or for the family? Or are they able to cope and do this at this point in time as well, because they can significantly reduce their costs as they go? So if we zoom in on family businesses in Abu Dhabi particularly, so they represent about 60% of non-oil GDP. And like we mentioned earlier, a big chunk of them are looking to make transitions or are expecting to have a transition event. So in that context, the transfer of a business from one generation to the next is probably one of the most demanding and most stressful bits of work that need to be done. And it takes usually somewhere between 5 to 15 years to put together and arrange, because that's the time that you typically need to finalize your estate plan, prepare and put in place any needed governance or management and other structures, make a choice of the successor that you want, groom the successor, or help them, assist them in their development. Either you bring in outside mentors or whatever other option you have, or to groom them to take over. And it's enough opportunity for that chosen successor to demonstrate their ability as they go down the line. So that's why I would typically say you need 5 to 10, 15 years to get this done, especially if you're starting from nothing. If you've already got something and you're starting from somewhere, then that's a completely different thing. But now the pandemic, the challenges that the pandemic has brought on, it can also offer an opportunity to accelerate this development and the implementation of a succession plan. And families should consider looking at these if it is something that they want to achieve or want to arrange. And here you've got the pieces of the puzzle that you need to have at your that you need to manage in order to properly manage succession. You got to prepare the owner, because not every owner or principal or older generation, not all of them are ready to hand over. They need to have something else to do if they're going to step down. If the only thing they've ever done in their entire life is to work, 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 and nothing else, and they have no other hobbies, no passions, no nothing, you're basically committing them to misery if the moment they leave the office, the family business. So they need to be prepared, personally prepared, to be able to take to be able to make that jump and that leap. You need to prepare the business. Do you have the governance in place? Do you have are the management team on board, et cetera, et cetera? Have you chosen your successor, prepared the successor, and so on? Have you prepared the ownership team? Because there are the rest of the family themselves. Are they ready for this? And they need to understand that. You need to train them, let's say, to understand how to read a balance sheet. So, what type of questions to ask at shareholder meetings, and guide them through that process. Make them understand that, and being part of family business, that means they're stewards for the next generation. They're not becoming shareholders for themselves. They're becoming shareholders with the idea of furthering the values of the company, maintaining the legacy of the company and the family business, and then maintaining it and making sure it is well protected and ready to continue for the next generation. They're basically stewards. They're there to make sure the business is well run and well managed so they can be handed over from one generation to the next. Unless, of course, the family decides that at some point they can sell it or do something else with it. But if they want to continue with the business, then that's the kind of the mindset that needs to go in there. For the family, as the wider family, are they going to be accepting the people that you've chosen to be the representatives on the ownership team? Are they happy with the choice of successor? Are there relationships that you need to iron out, issues that need to be ironed out? All these things are core parts of managing the process, because succession is not an event. It's just a one-time thing. It's a process over a period of time. It's if you don't manage it properly, you could have significant problems. Right? And then one of the other elements that sometimes is overlooked is having a contingency plan. So the contingency plan is essentially your emergency plan in case something goes wrong and you've not completed the full succession plan that you wanted to put into place. Those are your key pieces of the puzzle to get stuff done if you want to run through the succession. Now I understand that we're running a bit short on time, so I'm going to kind of run through. I don't have that many more slides to go, so. In terms of managing the succession, you have tons of legal and other tools to help you do that. Everything from foundations and trusts and multiple types of corporate structures, powers of attorney, boards of, for the business, how you run it, the board of directors, how you constitute it, whether you want to bring in external board members, non-family members, where you want to keep it just family members alone. And so on, how you structure the employment side of things. So are you going to allow family members to be part of the employment, part of the employee team? What are the conditions to bringing them on board? What are the salary structures you're going to apply, and so on and so forth? Are there any specific requirements as to you're not going to get anybody on board unless they're able to show that they have the capacity and the ability, basically select for the best, or are you open to everybody joining? All those decisions that need to be made and the tools that you have at your disposal to putting them down on paper or otherwise to facilitate this. All these legal tools, they're effectively just that, they're tools. Once you have a plan, you can open that toolbox, take out the tools that you think are going to be useful to help you achieve that plan, and then build the structure that is your succession, let's say the structure there. And that plan, it has to consider sometimes the competing interests of the business, the next generation, the wider family, other stakeholders like your customers, your employees, and so on and so forth. But succession, if it's well managed, it's an opportunity to bring fresh perspectives to management, revitalize a business to strategy, structure those parts of the business which need to be professionalized if there is one, and it's an opportunity to bring the family together around something. these plans that you put into place, they need to be flexible and adaptable, but you need to bear in mind always that you know, like the guy said once, I think it's a German, he's a German military tactician. He said, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So effectively, you know, your plans are going to change the moment you start putting them into place. They've got to build, you've got to build into them some flexibility. But always remember that if you don't have a plan, that's actually also a plan. Not having a plan is a plan. So on that note, I'm gonna close off, and I'll just leave you with a couple of quick thoughts. You know, in this climate, we've got to become adaptable. If we have to ingrain that culture of adaptability across the board, at least at the level of the family and the management team. And in doing so, obviously, we need to prepare for the worst, even if we're hoping for the very, very best. And ultimately, regardless of the decisions that are taken by the family or with regards to the business, if you restructure it completely, if you make some changes but not everything, whatever it is, even if the structure that comes out is completely so different, the family's values are going to remain there. And those values are what are going to provide stability and direction, whether it is to the family, to the wider family, not just within the ownership team and the management team and the principals themselves, but also to the stakeholders, so either to your customer base and to your employees and so your suppliers and so on. And that stability and direction should stay there to help guide you through the darkness until it gives way to light. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'll move on to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Ziad. I would say, like, given now we're almost at the end of the program, we've a lot of things that you've mentioned on today's session interlinks with different topics that we've covered with various partners before. So I can refer to sessions with Deloitte on liquidity solutions, operational and financial restructuring, on sessions with PwC around risk management, on sessions with EY, specifically on family businesses, KPMG as well. So it's interesting that we're having this session towards the end, that many things that you've mentioned kind of, yes, it applies for all businesses, but I mean, among it is the family businesses. So, and on that note, like you've referred to transitions, I would say in specific for family businesses, transitions would be different than any transition as a standard business, given that there is the business level and the family level. So transitions at the family level, which would be, I would say, more difficult and tough. And that comes to my question on succession planning. So you refer to succession planning various times. So why succession planning is such a difficult thing to do or implement or exercise, an exercise to go through at the family business?
Yeah, it's succession. Thanks for the question. Succession is hard because it's an explosive mix. You have emotion that meets the rational needs of the business, and sometimes you have to look at whether the family is putting what the objective of the family is, and to what level they're going to put the business before family. Sometimes it's going to feel that way. Letting go for a principal is extremely difficult to do. In general, they have to deal with their death because they have to think of what's going to happen after I'm no longer around, and that's not an easy thing for any normal human being to think of. It has to do with uncertainty about the future as well. So, which one of these multiple people that I'm considering to be the successor, who's going to be able to take on the job? Who will be willing to take on the job? It's not just the principal himself who has to worry about this, but it's also the rest of the family. Family members have to consider, do they want to be part of the family business? Not everybody does. It has to do with family politics. Sometimes, those can be difficult, especially if you're talking about if there are a large number of family members and from different marriages, let's say. So that can cause and create rifts and problems within the family as well. There's also this idea of, sometimes people want to avoid the difficult decisions, especially the ones that are really thorny. And so they're like, okay, so I'm just going to close my eyes and not deal with it until I have to. Sometimes also you might need to restructure the whole business to fit into the type of plan that you want to put in. If your organizational structure is very much, you decide what goes, and then you have to plan for your succession. Your succession might, that might not work. That model of operation doesn't necessarily work, or isn't going to serve the business, the family business down the line, especially if you want engagement from the rest of the family. It also shifts focus away from actually running the business for the people who are going to be planning it, the principals in general. And then there's so many different unknowns and elements that are completely outside of the control of people. So everything from, well, what if the chosen successor, something happens to them? What if, whether if there's a rift in the family? All these things make succession a really difficult and very prickly thing to kind of deal with. That's one reason why it tends to take a lot of time. You have to manage those different expectations and needs as you go.
On the same point, Ziad, one should family businesses start planning for succession planning?
As soon as the business is viable. So as early as you possibly can, I guess, is the simplest way of putting it. At the very least, have an emergency plan. But I know many people who don't necessarily want to hand over the management to their children. Let's say they want to give them the opportunity to do other things. They'd rather put in professional management to come in. So if you've got that in mind already, then kind of build towards it from now. So it becomes less difficult to do down the line. So obviously, the earlier you can do it, the better, because the less problems you have, the less risk you have of something happening in the meantime that can derail these ideas that you haven't actualized. I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, it did. I mean, as well, to add to this, I believe we've covered on previous sessions on what's probably necessary or where businesses should start now in planning for the future, and not only from a succession perspective, but in general. And I would say the common theme that came across was to identify core versus non-core. So, and that comes as well crosses what you've mentioned. So identify your value proposition, know what you want. This is something very, very critical, I would say. I think we can take one or two more questions max. So it depends on how you're gonna the length of your answer. So I'm gonna ask you about the biggest threat to the survival of family businesses. What's, in your opinion, is the biggest threat?
Not managing the transition, not preparing for a succession. That's probably the biggest threat for the survival of a family business at this point in time, especially in this region.
Okay. Then I have time for the final question. That's from Nadeem. So what are the pros and cons of a foundation organization versus a trust structure for the family business?
Right.
That's kind of legal as well from you.
Very legal. Yeah. Well, it depends on your objectives essentially, but the foundation, at least the foundation structure that's been put up at the Abu Dhabi Global Markets, for example, is a phenomenal tool for family businesses, because it's an independent legal entity, and that can be utilized for the benefit of the family. So you can decide how and what the purpose of the foundation is, and as long as it's limited to the family itself, then you can create it. So you can't set up an NGO there, basically, in other words. I find it depends on what you want to use it for. As a use case, it can be an extraordinary tool. It's a different concept with a trust, because a trust is essentially you don't own the assets anymore. The trustee owns the assets. So it's an English legal concept of sorts. The trustee owns the legal assets, and you've got the beneficiaries that have the beneficial ownership of it. So they've separated that. It's typically trusts don't have a legal personality behind them. So effectively, let's say you can't just, you can't get a license for the trust and go register assets in its name. You'd have to create numerous structures underneath, like another separate company or corporate entity, and then you register the assets in the name of that entity. So then, depending on the regime that you choose for the trusts, it can be a bit more complicated as to who can be a trustee and what they can do. So it's much more tightly regulated in that sense. With the foundation, you have the flexibility in this, for example, of having the previous owners, because again, you're going to have to transfer ownership of assets to the foundation, but at the very least, it still remains within the control of the family in that sense, because you can choose who the directors of the foundation are, and they can be family members as well. So there are, it's a bit also typically a bit less expensive than having a trust in place, but it's very much an issue of objectives. So once we study a specific use case, we can see it's a tool. Either of them are tools. Depending on what your objectives are, we can build something for that adapts for that. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Ziad, for the answer. Any last words before I close?
Yeah, one quick idea. I think I touched quickly on the idea of the contingency plan. And I want to give a quick example as to why a contingency plan is useful and how sometimes those things can be a bit shocking in the context of succession as well. And so there was this was a few years back now, but you had a large family business that had completed a successful transition to the son of the founder. And the son, obviously he did very well. He took it from strength to strength. And then some years passed away, and then that person passed away. Some years passed, and that person unexpectedly passed away very suddenly, very tragically. And then the family had the very difficult and unenviable task of having to kind of roll everything back and have the founder come back into the business to run it. So to step in again and take over the reins. And that's, and there was obviously a lag. It was difficult for everybody concerned to kind of bear in mind. So it's a very extreme example, maybe a tragic one, of course, but it highlights the importance of having a contingency plan in place in case what you've got in place today, for whatever reason, there's an emergency and something happens, and you need to have somebody step in quickly to help steer it. The contingency plans can also be things like your business continuity plans that everybody's talking about now these days, that talk about what do you do in case there is something like a pandemic and you have to work remotely. So there are these are very different poles for what a contingency plan is. One of them is your business continuity that actually deals with your operations in case the office is no longer there because there's a fire, all the way through to, well, if your management team is no longer there, the founders are no longer there, the core key family members are no longer there, what do you do? And it's a sudden event. What is the system that you got in place? So there's a lot of leeway, but those are important things for families to consider, and especially in something like this, and in this particular climate. So just I know it's a bit of a downer. I'm sorry, but yeah.
No, it will definitely be noted by audience. We've lost you for a couple of seconds. I hope it was only at my end. But anyway, it was just a couple of seconds. I want to thank you again, Ziad, and thank the audience for their time as well to attend the session. Hope you find it insightful. Next week, we're going to be off. Sunday is going to be vacation, and Tuesday, we shuffled the session for Tuesday for the week after. So stay tuned for the last two sessions of Chamber Talk, sessions 22 and 23, with EY on securing now, next, and beyond with enterprise and cyber resilience. And the last session of Chamber Talk going to be with Ziad, again, on legal and operational considerations for businesses, an overview of aspects that businesses can explore as the impact of the pandemic continues to unveil. Until then, stay safe and have a good long weekend.
Yes.
Have a good
Thank
day.
you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.